My name is Sarah Vantiel. I'm 30 years old. And the evening my uncle stood up at a family dinner and turned my firm into a punchline was the evening I understood that the people closest to you are sometimes the last ones to see what you're building, and that this is, in a strange way, useful information. He did not whisper it. He pushed his chair back from the table, picked up his glass, and spoke at the volume of a man who expected the room to follow him, which it did. There were 11 people at that table. My grandmother at the head. My mother to her left. My Aunt Cecile, my 2 older cousins, my cousin's husband, a family friend named Dottie, who had known my grandmother since the 70s, and my Uncle Bernard himself, who had been in residential real estate for 30 years and considered this a credential that extended to opinions about every built environment on Earth. To my niece, he said, and her imaginary architecture firm. May it one day exist. The laugh that followed was not the laugh of people who thought it was cruel. It was the laugh of people who were relieved someone had said out loud what several of them had been thinking. My mother touched my arm, not to stop me from responding, but the way you touch someone when you want them to know you are aware the moment is happening. My cousin Dottie looked at her plate. I lifted my glass, smiled at Bernard across the table, and let the moment complete itself. Then I asked my grandmother if she wanted more water, and she said yes, and I got up and got the pitcher, and that was what I did with the next 30 seconds. What none of them knew, what I had not said at that table or any other, was that 3 weeks earlier I had submitted a project for a regional design prize that I had no certainty of winning and every structural reason to believe we deserved to be considered for. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. I grew up in a family where the built environment was Bernard's territory. He had been selling houses since before I was born, and the authority that came with that, the vocabulary, the opinions about square footage and lot lines, and what a kitchen renovation actually costs, had calcified over 3 decades into something that functioned less like expertise and more like jurisdiction. Bernard knew what buildings were worth. Bernard knew what people paid for them. Bernard knew, therefore, what architecture was and was not, and his view of what architecture was did not extend to something a 28-year-old woman with a 2-person firm and a shared office space could meaningfully be doing. This was not malice. That is the thing I want to be clear about, because it would be easier if it were. Bernard was not a cruel man. He was a man who had organized his entire professional identity around a version of the real estate world that had rewarded him for 30 years, and anything that suggested the industry had more dimensions than he'd accounted for read to him, not as new information, but as a challenge to the validity of his own knowledge. My firm was not a real firm, because if it were a real firm, he would have known about it. That was the logic, and it was circular, and it was completely sincere. My mother's position was more complicated. She was proud of me in the way that parents who are also worried about you are proud, a pride that is always accompanied by a secondary clause. She told people I was an architect. She showed people my website. She also asked me, every time we talked, whether I had thought about taking on more residential projects, because residential was stable, residential was what people needed, residential was something she understood and could explain to her friends. I had explained to her, more than once, that my firm's focus was institutional and commercial, civic buildings, cultural spaces, mid-sized commercial interiors, and that this was a deliberate choice based on where I believed our work was strongest and where the market had room for what we were doing. She listened each time and then asked again the next time, which told me the explanation was not the thing she needed. I stopped explaining and started just answering the how are things question with specifics she could hold on to. A new client, a completed project, a shortlist, things that were concrete enough to be repeated. I had started the firm, Vantiel Studio, 22 months before that family dinner, in a sublet office on the 4th floor of a building that also housed a litigation support firm and a regional nonprofit. My co-founder was a structural engineer named Otto Brask, who I had worked alongside at a mid-sized firm called Harmonday Associates for 4 years before we left within 3 months of each other and decided, over a very long lunch, that the market we both kept noticing was not one that Harmonday was positioned to serve. The market was mid-sized civic and cultural institutions, libraries, community art centers, small museums, civic hall renovations, that needed design at a level of rigor and specificity that the large firms couldn't offer at a price point that worked for publicly funded clients, and that the small sole practitioner firms couldn't offer at the scale and organizational complexity these clients actually required. We believed we were positioned exactly between those two options. We built a business plan around that belief and stress-tested it with a consultant named Randall Fitch, who spent 4 hours taking it apart and 3 hours putting it back together in a more defensible form. Our first commission was a reading room renovation for a branch library in the eastern part of the city. The budget was $380,000. The client was a library board represented by a director named Constance Hale, who had been referred to us by an architect we'd both worked under at Harmon Day named Marcus Webb, who had retired and was routing his former clients to people he trusted. Constance was organized and specific and did not suffer imprecision. She gave us a detailed brief on the first day and asked how long we needed to respond to it. I said 5 business days.
She said 4, and we said yes.
The reading room project came in on time and $11,000 under budget. Constance sent a letter to our office that I still have. It said the board had received more unsolicited public comment about the renovation than about any other capital project in the branch's recent history, and that the comments were uniformly positive, and that she would be referring us. She referred us twice in the following year. Both referrals converted. Year 1 revenue for Vaniel Studio was $614,000, split between 4 completed projects and 2 that carried into year 2. Otto and I each paid ourselves $78,000, which was less than we had made at Harmon Day and more than enough, and we reinvested the remainder in a dedicated drafting workstation, project management software, and a junior designer named Priya Sani, who we hired at the start of year 2 and who was within 8 months doing work that required almost no revision before it went to clients. Year 2 revenue, $1.1 million. We moved out of the sublet and into our own space, 1,800 square feet in a building that had good light and a loading dock that occasionally blocked the parking, which we lived with because the light was worth it. We added a second junior designer and a part-time office manager named Greta Voss, who reorganized our invoicing process in her first week in a way that recovered $14,000 in outstanding payments we had been too busy to follow up on properly. I called Greta's previous employer to ask about her before we made the offer. The employer said, "She will find every inefficiency you have and fix it before you notice it's broken." I said that sounded right and made the offer. The dinner where Bernard made the toast was 18 months into year 2. We had 6 active projects. We had a wait list. We had been shortlisted for a civic commission that would have been the largest project in the firm's history if we'd gotten it. We didn't. We came second, which I knew because the selection committee chair, a city planner named Douglas Wren, called me personally to tell me, which was not something they did for every firm that didn't make the cut. He said, "You were very close." The decision came down to relationships the other firm had been building for 15 years. That's not a reflection of the work. I said I understood, and I did. What I also understood sitting with that call was that the gap between where we were and where we needed to be to win commissions of that scale was a relationship gap, not a work quality gap.
The work was ready.
The network wasn't. That was actionable. I started attending the regional professional association events that I had been skipping because they conflicted with project deadlines. I submitted written commentary on 2 proposed civic projects that went before the City Planning Commission, detailed technical commentary that demonstrated we had read the full project specifications and had substantive views about them. One of the commission members, an architect named Laurel Bassett, wrote back to acknowledge our submission. I replied with a brief note. She replied again. That exchange, over 6 months, became a professional relationship that would matter later. I also, in the 3rd quarter of year 2, submitted 2 projects for the Veldon Prize. The Veldon Prize was the most significant recognition in our regional market for institutional and civic architecture. It was awarded annually by a jury of 7 practicing architects, 2 academics, and 1 representative from a civic body. It had been running for 19 years. The previous winners included firms that had been operating for 2 and 3 decades. The youngest firm ever to win it had been in practice for 11 years at the time of their award. We had been in practice for 2 years and 8 months. I submitted the library reading room renovation and a community arts center we had completed 6 months earlier, a 12,000 square foot adaptive reuse of a former light industrial building for a nonprofit arts organization called the Foundry Collective. The Foundry project had taken 14 months and had a construction budget of $2.3 million. It was, at the time, the most complex project we had executed, and the work on it, the way Otto had resolved the structural problem of the existing roof decking, the way we had organized the light through the clear-story windows we'd introduced on the north elevation, was work I would put against anything we had seen shortlisted for the prize in the previous 3 years. I submitted both projects and told Otto and told Priya and told no one else. Not my mother. Not anyone at any family event. The submission window closed, the jury convened, the shortlist was announced 4 months later, and our name was on it, in the civic and cultural category for the Foundry Collective project. I read the shortlist announcement in my office on a Tuesday morning and sat with it for a moment, and then went and told Otto, who looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. He said, "Okay." I said, "Yeah." We went back to work. The family dinner was 3 weeks after the shortlist announcement, which I had still not mentioned to anyone outside the office. It was my grandmother's birthday dinner, held at my Aunt Cecile's house, which was large enough to seat 11 people comfortably and had a dining room table that Bernard had always treated as his preferred stage. He made the toast toward the end of the main course. I have already told you what he said. I have already told you how I responded. What I will add is this. As I walked back to my seat with the water pitcher, I caught my grandmother's eye. She was watching me in the way she watched things she was still forming an opinion about, not unkindly but seriously, the way you look at something you intend to understand. She had built a small alterations and tailoring business over 40 years, starting in her kitchen and ending with 2 storefronts and a staff of 7, and she had done it without anyone in the family treating it as a real business until the second storefront opened. She knew what the toast meant. She knew what my not responding meant. She gave me the smallest possible nod and reached for her own glass. I was the last one to leave that night. I helped Cecile with the dishes. I said goodnight to my grandmother and held her hand for a moment at the door. I drove home in the dark. The jury notification arrived on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the dinner. It came as an email from the prize administrator, a woman named Heloise Strand, whose name I recognized from her work on the awards communications. The subject line was, "Veldon Prize, Jury Decision, Foundry Collective." I read it standing at my kitchen counter. Vaniel Studio had been selected as the winner of the Veldon Prize in the Civic and Cultural Architecture category for the Foundry Collective project. The formal announcement would go out the following Monday morning. The award ceremony was in 6 weeks. She asked me to confirm receipt and to provide names for the acceptance party's guest list. I put the phone face down on the counter. I stood there for a while. Then I picked it up and called Otto. He answered on the second ring. I read him the first 2 sentences of the email. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. He said, "I need you to forward that to me right now." I forwarded it. I heard him open it on the other end. Another pause. He said, "We should probably tell Priya." I said, "Tomorrow?"
He said, "Yeah."
"Tomorrow." We stayed on the phone another few minutes without saying much of substance and then said goodnight. I did not call my mother that evening. I had decided, sometime in the 6 weeks since the dinner, that I would not be managing anyone else's reaction to this news before I had finished having my own. The announcement went out Monday morning through the prize organization's communications channels, their website, their industry newsletter, and a press release distributed to the regional architecture and design press. By 10 o'clock, 3 trade publications had run mentions. By noon, the Foundry Collective's executive director, a woman named Iris Pemberton, had sent flowers to the studio with a note that said simply, "This is exactly right." Laurel Bassett, the Planning Commission architect, sent a personal email. Douglas Wren, who had called me when we came second on the Civic Commission, sent one as well. Marcus Webb, who had retired from Harmon Day and sent us our first client, called and left a voicemail that was 47 seconds long and ended with him saying, "I told Constance you were going to be worth watching. I want my credit." I saved that voicemail. My phone rang 9 times between 9 in the morning and noon. I took 4 of the calls and let 5 go to voicemail. The ones I took, Otto, Priya, Greta, and Iris Pemberton. The ones I let go, 2 numbers I didn't recognize, a call from an architecture school that wanted to know if I would speak to their students, and 2 family numbers. One of those family numbers was my mother. The other was Bernard. I called my mother back at 12:30 when the morning had settled. She picked up immediately and said, "I saw it. I've been seeing it everywhere since 9 o'clock this morning."
Patricia sent it to me. Dottie sent it to me.
Cecile called. I said, "I know. I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. It's been a busy morning." She said, "Why didn't you tell me you were submitted?" I said, "I wasn't certain how it would go." A pause. She said, "You won the biggest prize in the region." I said, "In the civic and cultural category, yes." She said, "Sarah." Just my name, with a particular weight behind it. I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "I'm very proud of you. I want you to know that I mean that." I said, "I know you do." We talked for another 10 minutes.
She asked about the ceremony.
She asked whether she could come. I said yes, of course she could come. She said she would clear her schedule. Then she said carefully, "Bernard called me this morning." I waited. She said, "He saw the announcement. He wanted me to let you know he's been thinking about renovating his kitchen, the one in the Hillcrest house. He thought you might want to be involved." I let the sentence settle. I said, "I appreciate you telling me." She said, "You don't have to respond to him." I said, "I know." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to go back to work. I have a client meeting at 2. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh. I said I'd talk to her soon, and we hung up. Bernard's text arrived at 4:17 that afternoon. I had seen it come in at noon and had not opened it. I opened it now, sitting at my desk after the client meeting, with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. It said, "Sarah, saw the news, very impressive. Always knew you had it in you. I've been thinking about redoing the Hillcrest kitchen, gut renovation, maybe open the wall to the dining room. Thought you might want to take a look. Let me know." I read it twice. I set my phone face down on the desk. I picked up my coffee, found it cold, set it down again. I thought about the table, the glass he'd raised, the 11 people in that room, my grandmother's nod, the 4 months between the submission and the shortlist announcement during which I had gone to work every morning without mentioning it to anyone at a family dinner or a Sunday call, the 6 weeks between the shortlist and the award during which I had done the same. I thought about what I wanted to say and what I actually wanted, which were not exactly the same thing. What I wanted to say had a particular shape to it. It was not long. It would have been satisfying to send in the way that things are satisfying for approximately 11 minutes before they become something you have to carry. What I actually wanted was to go back to work, to call Iris Pemberton about the reception, to look at the project that was sitting half-finished on my drafting screen, to call Otto about the new inquiry that had come in from a school board that had seen the announcement and wanted to talk about a library renovation. I picked up my phone. I opened Bernard's message. I typed, "Thanks, Bernard. I appreciate you reaching out. Residential isn't in our scope. We focus on civic and institutional work. Wishing you well with the project." I sent it. I put the phone in my desk drawer. I opened the project file on my screen and got back to work. The Veldon Prize ceremony was held on a Friday evening at a civic hall in the center of the city, a building that had itself won a design prize 12 years earlier, which the MC noted in his opening remarks with the particular self-referential pleasure of people who love their industry. There were approximately 280 people in attendance. Long tables with good lighting. The kind of room where everyone knows most of the names and is quietly tracking the rest. My mother came. Priya came. Otto brought his partner. Greta came, which I hadn't expected, and when I told her she didn't have to, she said she'd rearranged one thing, and it wasn't a problem. Laurel Bassett was there. She found me before the program started and shook my hand and said she had walked through the Foundry Collective the previous month on a site visit for an unrelated project, and the clear story work on the north elevation was, in her words, exactly the right answer to a hard problem. I thanked her. She said she hoped we'd have occasion to work together at some point. I said I hoped so too. The prize in our category was announced 40 minutes into the program. The jury chair, an architect named Piotr Halm, whose work I had studied in school, read a statement about the Foundry Collective project that was 3 paragraphs long. He talked about the resolution of the structural problem. He talked about the light. He talked about the way the building served its community in ways that were measurable in attendance figures. The Foundry had seen a 340% increase in weekly programming since the renovation, and in ways that were not. He read our name. Otto and I walked to the stage together. We shook Piotr Hom's hand. The award was a physical object, a cast piece, about the weight of a full coffee mug that I held in both hands while they took the photograph. I said thank you to the room in less than 40 words, and meant all of them. We walked back to the table. My mother was sitting very still with her hands folded in front of her. When I sat down, she put one hand briefly on top of mine, and then took it away. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. In the 6 weeks that followed the ceremony, things happened that I want to account for because they are part of the honest shape of what came next. The first was that the school board inquiry converted into a commission, a branch library renovation in a district that had been underfunded for 15 years and was finally receiving a capital allocation. The project budget was $1.87 million. The board's facilities director, a woman named Renovations, had found us through the prize announcement and had read the full jury citation before she made contact. She said in her first email that the language Piotr Hom had used about community measurable impact was exactly the language her board had been trying to apply to their capital planning. I replied within 2 hours. The second was that Laurel Bassett forwarded our name to a planning committee that was in the early stages of scoping a civic community center project, a larger commission, still in the feasibility phase, with a projected construction budget somewhere between $4.5 million and $6 million depending on final program scope. We were invited to submit a qualifications package. We submitted it in 10 days. The selection process would take several months. We had been in this position before, and we knew how to be patient with it. The third was that Marcus Webb, who had retired and sent us our first client and left the voicemail, sent a handwritten note that arrived at the studio 10 days after the ceremony. It said, "The work earned it. Keep going." I had it framed and put it on the wall beside the drafting station where Priya worked because she had been in the room for most of the Foundry Collective project and the credit belonged to all of us. The fourth was that Bernard called my mother. She told me about it on a Sunday, in the matter-of-fact way she had learned to deliver information about Bernard since the dinner. He had called to say he thought it was wonderful that I'd won the prize. He had also mentioned, again, the Hillcrest kitchen. He had suggested that my mother might want to pass along that he was serious about the project and that the budget was generous. I was quiet for a moment. My mother said, "I told him you'd replied to his text and that I wasn't going to relay messages." I said, "Thank you." She said, "He means well, Sarah. You know how he is." I said, "I do know." She said, "Are you angry with him?" I thought about that honestly. I ran the question against what I actually felt when I thought about the toast, about the table, about the glass raised at the volume of a man who expected the room to follow him. I said, "No. I think I was, for a while. But I'm mostly just not interested in revisiting it." She said, "That's probably the healthiest thing." I said, "Probably." We talked about the library commission and about her plans for the following month and about my grandmother, who had called me the week after the ceremony and said simply, "I watched you build that. I'm glad it's being seen," which was the most she said about it, and more than enough. I want to tell you something about the 18 months between starting the firm and the night Bernard raised his glass, because those months are the actual story, in the way that the visible parts of things are rarely where the weight is held. Otto and I had a rule in those 18 months that we never said out loud but both understood. We did not talk about what the firm might become. We talked about the project in front of us. We talked about the client meeting on Thursday and the construction document deadline on the 15th and the detail we hadn't resolved on the third floor elevation. We did not talk about whether the firm would last because there was no answer to that question that was useful to either of us, and the only thing that was useful was the project in front of us. This was not optimism. It was a structural choice about where to put attention. The attention went to the work. The work produced the next client. The next client produced the work after that. The toast at the dinner table did not enter into it at any point in that chain, and that, not discipline, not strategy, not the prize, was the actual mechanism. Priya asked me once in the second year what I would tell someone who was starting out and was unsure whether the thing they were building was real. She was asking about herself, obliquely, the way people do when they're not yet certain they have the right to ask directly. I thought about it and said, the building is real when it serves the person who needs it. Everything else is a question of time. She wrote it in her notebook. I saw her do it and didn't say anything. The thing about the people who do not believe in what you are building is that they are not, in most cases, your adversaries. They are the record of what was visible before you built it. Bernard's toast was accurate on the day he made it. From where he was standing, with the information he had, the firm was small enough to be imaginary. He was not wrong about what he could see. He was wrong about what was coming, and the difference between those two errors is the whole of the story. You cannot make someone see past what's in front of them. You can only build past it. That is what I know. That is the only thing that has been consistently true across every version of this that I've watched or lived. If you were in a room when someone raised a glass to what you were building and the room laughed, if you sat at that table and stayed quiet and drove home in the dark, I want to ask you something. In the weeks after that evening, on the mornings when you went back to the project in front of you, what was the first thing you did when you sat down? What was the thing you returned to? Because I think you already know that the answer to the toast was always going to be in that room, at that desk, at that hour. Not at the table. If this story found you today, share it with someone who is building something that people around them can't see yet. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. I'll see you in the comments.